Let's face it, most people do not give away a working lawnmower, at least for free. So this lawnmower was being given away by a very generous person, and I was lucky enough to pick it up. The problem is that it's now my responsibility to try and fix it even though I don't have any information about it. But looking at it, it's pretty safe to assume that it's not going to start. So hopefully this goes well, otherwise I'm in for a real nightmare. In today's video, we're going to be looking at this Yard Machines lawnmower, and the problem is that I have no idea what's wrong with it. The first thing I'm going to do is look it over and make sure it's not missing anything vital for it to run. And fortunately, it looks to be complete, which is great news since we won't need to buy any parts for it, like the brake cable, which seems to break quite often. Now, if you do find yourself needing parts for the mower, try and find all the stickers you can on the mower. But if you need the parts for the engine instead, you'll have to look at the stickers that are on the engine and not on the mower. I know the sticker on top of the engine has a lot of information on it, but unfortunately it doesn't have what you're looking for. So before we try and start this mower, it's best that we check the engine oil first, otherwise we could damage it, and since we have zero history with this mower, it's probably a good idea. And what we find is kind of interesting. Turns out the oil is clean, but it's also a couple of ounces over the full mark, which is not ideal. I also checked that there was some gasoline in the fuel tank, and even though I'm not sure what kind of condition it's in, we're still going to try and start it anyway. Also, check and make sure that the blade isn't missing on the mower because starting a lawnmower without one is really tough to do. So of course it's not going to start because that would have been too easy. Next we'll take off the air filter so we can physically prime the engine with some gasoline. This test will see if the problem is with the carb or the fuel that's in the tank. Now that was not your standard test run. In fact, it seemed like the engine wanted to stay running. Let's try that again and see if it'll do the same thing or if we get a better result. So surprisingly, this time it stayed running, which is pretty amazing considering its condition. So it was surging a bit where the engine doesn't want to keep a constant speed, but I think a good carb cleaning might just fix that. So since we know this mower is going to be a good candidate for us to fix and sell, I'm going to take this chance to clean it first before we go too much further with the project. Of course, this is not needed, but it's always nice when the buyers mention how clean it is and that it looks nowhere near its age. So let's talk about testing and the other results we could have had with it. So if you had primed the engine and it did not start, then I would check the spark plug's condition while at the same time check that the ignition system was still working. And if the spark plug was okay and we also had spark, then I check and see if the timing was off by inspecting the flywheel key. After that, you'd want to do a compression test to make sure that the engine was not worn out and that the valve train was working as well. Now this particular engine has an automatic choke for the carb to help start it when the engine is cold. And if that system has failed, the engine will not start, but from what I can see right now, it should be working. Just check and make sure that this linkage is connected to this arm and that the choke lever is in the closed position like this one is. So if you didn't notice it, there's a lot of dirt covering the carb area and there's also some on the cooling fins on the engine, which is not a good thing. So to make sure that the engine will not overheat when it's running and for a bit of cleanliness, we'll spray this area down. And besides that, we need to take the carb off the engine for an inspection and we sure don't want to get any more dirt inside it. So of course, I'm also going to clean off the wheels as well, only because it's a detail that most sellers don't seem to address. I do have to admit that I didn't pay too much attention to the wheels either early on, but now that there's so much competition out there, I think it's worth it. So once the water had a chance to dry off, turns out this mower is in really good condition. It was just needing a good thorough cleaning. So first up, we want to drain out as much of that gasoline from the fuel tank as possible and see if there's anything wrong with it. And what we find now makes total sense. As you can see, what we have here is really stale gasoline. That's the reason why the engine didn't want to start and stay running. The fuel was simply lacking that punch that it used to have when new. So it looks like we have a case of gasoline being left in the fuel tank for a long time. Or the other possibility is that the gasoline went stale in the fuel can and then it was put into the tank. Either way, we need to take the carb off the engine and inspect it along with a good cleaning if it's really bad. It's also a lot easier to do this if we take the fuel tank off with the carb, but it's your choice if you don't want to do it this way. Watch out for the O-ring and plastic retainer. Sometimes they'll be left on the intake pipe and will need to be put back on the carb. Now, there is a really good reason why taking off the fuel tank is a good idea, and that is it gives you the chance to clean it if there's a lot of debris inside it. Now, this one wasn't that bad, but it did have some debris in there, so I'll give it a quick spray and rinse and then let it completely dry out in the sun. Next, we'll take off the screws that hold the fuel bowl to the carb, pry it loose, and then see how bad it is in there. So luckily the screen in the fuel tank did its job and no debris made it to the fuel bowl. We'll then pour out the fuel and then let it dry out in the sun. Since we have immediate access to the main fuel jet, we might as well make sure it's as clear as it can be, and to do that I'll use my carb cleaning wires, but there are other ways. Just find the wire that fits inside the opening and then move it around, letting the wire clean the jet, and then see if the next size wire will fit and do the same with it. And as you can see, there is a very slight difference, but it could mean the difference between a good running engine and one that won't start. Now, even though this should be good enough, I want to go through it just a bit further and take out the cartridge and inspect the other jet. And what we find is a clogged jet, which might explain the surging we heard earlier. Now, you can use whatever method you want to clean this jet, whether that's compressed air, carb cleaner, or using the wires, and if you don't have any other option, try spraying it with running water. The only problem is that you'll have to let the parts dry off if you use water instead of the other options mentioned. And after making sure that all the other openings in the cartridge are cleared as well, we'll put the cartridge back together and then install it back into the carb. Now don't worry, it only fits one way, so don't force it if it won't go back together. Then carefully install the fuel bowl, making sure that it's not crooked, otherwise the carb might leak or have other problems. Now if you do install the bowl and it is crooked, take it back off and try it again. Now once the screws have been replaced, take another good look at it again, and if it's okay, we'll keep going. Also, be sure that all the water is gone from the fuel tank if you did end up cleaning it like we had to do with this one. Now before you try and install the carb, we'll have to install the O-ring and the retainer on the back of the carb. So this is the only thing sealing the carb to the intake system, so it's very important, otherwise you could end up having running or even starting problems. Be very careful when installing the carb to the intake pipe. Try not to push it all the way onto the pipe. That's because the air box that attaches to it will help to locate it on the pipe for you. Also, when attaching the arm for the thermostat bypass, make sure the arm is positioned behind the post for the choke lever. This will ensure that the bypass will work the way it's supposed to, otherwise the arm will be in the wrong location, causing the bypass not to work. So here's one important tip. Since we opened the carb and took it apart, there's now a very slim chance that the carb could leak gasoline. And if that does happen, don't leave it like that. You'll have to take the carb off, take it apart, and see if something didn't line up like it was supposed to. Also, don't forget to reconnect the emissions hose to the port on the back of the air box. Otherwise, on this style of carb, a lot of unfiltered air will make it into the engine. Now the air filter that came off this engine was in great shape, so I'll reuse it for right now, but I'll put a new one on here before I sell it. I know some viewers may not agree with me, but the more maintenance items that I can do before I sell it makes it a whole lot easier to sell the mower. Now the last major item we need to take care of is to make sure that the blade is balanced so there's no extra vibrations from it when the engine is running. So this style of blade and its opening for the bolt makes it really tricky to place it on the cone for the balancer, so take your time. So I do have to apologize, but this table is not level, so it makes using the cone a little bit more difficult. Now it is okay if you can't get it perfectly balanced, just so long as it's not wildly out of balance, but if you feel like it has to be perfect, we'll go for it. So one important step that is unique to this style of mowing deck is making sure that the bolts that hold on the front and rear plastics are tight. These like to back out and get loose over time, and they'll eventually fall off the mower, so check that they're tight once every couple of years. The very last item on our list is making sure to apply some sort of lubricant to the wheels. Now, if they already spin somewhat well, then spraying a lube on the front and the back of the wheel will be fine. But if it's really tough to spin the wheel, you'll have to take the wheel off for a good cleaning before applying your lube. Finally, we're done with all the cleaning and maintenance. Now we get to see if all that work is paid off. So it started up just fine and ran without the surging from before. But the bigger question is, how will it start when it's hot? So just as a point of reference, the valve cover is now at 134 degrees Fahrenheit, while the cylinder head is 215 degrees, which is not full temperature, but for a 5-minute test run, I'll take it. Now don't worry, I always do a full mowing test after I fix them, but if that's not possible for some reason, I'll do a 15-minute run test instead. The last thing that I want is for the customer to come back and say that something's wrong with the mower and it's because I didn't test it long enough. Now I did have a mower come back recently after 3 months of ownership, and the reason turned out to be a design flaw with the mower. But I still serviced it under warranty because the person who bought it from me was a good friend and a coworker. There is obviously no point in talking about money on this one because aside from a new $2 air filter and some oil and consumables, this one will be a great return once it's sold. Yes, it would have been great if it was a self-propelled mower because I would then be able to ask more for it, but there's nothing wrong with a good, easy to use push mower too. Now don't worry, I will do an oil change after my longer test run, but for right now, this project is done. So my question is, how much more would you pay for a self-propelled mower than the same mower that was just a push mower? Now personally, I'd pay almost double for the convenience of having self-propel, but for some, it may not be that important. Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.